Dark times are coming for the Russian Federation. In other words, could the Kiev regime really achieve that blackout in Moscow, which Vladimir Zelensky has been talking about so much lately? And what does the new missile that Ukraine launched not so long ago have to do with all this? We're here, precisely, to analyze the impact of this latest one. The new Ukrainian missile, Flamingo, was announced by the Kiev regime and, they even say, already launched against Russian territory, with rather uncertain results so far, mostly laughter, both among Russian military personnel and the civilian population. Be that as it may, the superweapon is supposed to change the course of the war, leave Moscow in the dark, and therefore throw the Kremlin into utter and absolute panic. But today, we're here to see how much of this is true, and whether the new Ukrainian missile really has that capability or not. On the one hand, to inflict enough damage on the Russian Federation, and on the other, to turn the tide of the conflict. Ukraine. As usual, let's start right from the beginning. We're talking about the Flamingo missile that Ukraine launched not so long ago, and in fact, we discussed it on this very channel. So you have the video there with the specific features of this particular missile. However, what matters to us today is to see to what extent something like this could achieve anything, like a turning point in this conflict, turning into a real threat for the Federation. In the background, as context, we have these increasingly repeated promises and threats, which are also being highlighted more and more by Western media, especially from Volodymyr Zelensky, suggesting that Ukraine could carry out a blackout operation in Moscow, that is, to leave the capital of the Russian Federation, and therefore one of its weakest points, but also one of its best protected, practically, completely in the dark. For now, though, the opposite is actually happening. And in another fairly recent video, we talked about the blackout that the Russian Federation caused in the capital of Ukraine, that is, in the very city of Kiev. Now then, could things really turn around this time? Or are we just talking about a media show that's being used by different actors, among other things like, what things? For example, money laundering. Let's go into more detail about this. In addition to the videos of these supposed Flamingo missile tests, as well as its main features, all of this seems to be very closely related to the United Kingdom as FP5 Millennium Missile, which is a very important point. And in fact, some sources are saying that the United Kingdom lent these construction instructions to Ukraine, and based on them, Ukraine practically achieved a miracle. They built a missile just as powerful, or even more so, with a much larger explosive payload than its United Kingdom counterpart. But at the same time, it costs infinitely less. And we're basically talking about the cheapest missile, especially in terms of features and price. In other words, an incredible value for money. Good, nice, and cheap. Now let's go into more detail. And besides the tests that were carried out, about which we don't know much, it seems that recently, this missile, according to several sources, was shot down in the Russian Federation. I understand that it was precisely this missile. Another possibility? Is it also true that Ukraine, well, launched some kind of decoy there to mislead Russia, or maybe even directly deceive their intelligence services? So it looks like their missile really isn't as powerful as it actually is? Whatever the case, the photos of the missile in question made almost all Russian social media laugh, as well as a large part of Ukrainian sources. Because the technical specifications that were on paper, considering the capacity, I mean the electronic system embedded in the missile, seemed a bit unrealistic. Who knows us? I chose this particular publication because maybe it's the one that best sums up the tone with which the news of that shoot-down was received. Above all, considering how the missile in question was perceived within Russian society. The widely publicized Ukrainian Flamingo FP5 Millennium Missile United Kingdom version was shot down for the first time in the Special Military Operation Area. It is reported that the missile was shot down by the Panzer S-1 anti-aircraft system near the front line. The missile was not equipped with stealth elements. It lit up on the radar like a Christmas tree and was shot down at an altitude of 100 meters. Upon examining the wreckage, it was discovered that its engine was an AI-25 from the 1960s, taken from the L-39 Albatross training aircraft. The electronics turned out to be Chinese, and inside there were microchips with the address of a Kia manufacturing company. This post might need to be supplemented so that we can go into more detail with this other one, which this time is published by a blogger influencer. You could also say he's very famous in Ukraine. Anatoly Sherry spoke in these terms, and here we are directly referring in his name to Ukrainian sources. Because no matter how critical he is of Volodymyr Zelensky, he is still a source that indeed comes from Ukrainian society. We continue studying the legendary flamenco that, they say, will destroy Moscow. IP is the degree of protection of the product, and in this case we see that it is IP20, the same IP20 rating, writes Anatoly Sherry. They have the garlands, and moreover, the garlands with this degree of protection are intended exclusively for indoor use. IP44. This, in comparison, is made for outdoor use, under a roof or without direct exposure to rain and snow. About the power supply and the plug. The diodes in the garland's cable can withstand any temperature, writes Sherry, from -40 to +50. The important thing is that the power supply stays dry and therefore insulated. IP56, are you still comparing? It's made for outdoor use with direct exposure to rain and snow, since the cables, diodes, and power supply are made of rubber. And wow, IP20 unprotected product, only suitable for indoor use. I mean, basically, even the Ukrainian sources, from what we can see, were laughing at the missile in question. However, Sherry later updated the information. Update in defense of the super rocket about IP20. If this product is packaged in an absolutely airtight container, isn't it pointless to do it with a higher protection rating? That is, maybe the ones who designed it, if they actually did. This missile in Ukraine, they might be right in the sense that there wasn't really a need for a higher protection rating either. So it's better to save a few euros and make it so that the production of these missiles can actually be carried out on a large scale. I don't know to what extent these arguments should convince us, whether the missile in question is junk or a Wunderwaffe. What I am sure about is the impact that this information had, especially within Russian society. At first, obviously, as soon as Ukraine issued this warning and announced that they were indeed debuting a new missile, months ago, I'm telling you, there was a sort of concern. Because there was uncertainty, people didn't really know what it was about. Now that this missile, supposedly this very one, has been intercepted by the Russian Federation and they saw what was inside, the concern has turned more into an ironic, sarcastic tone, and it seems that the danger is no longer there. However, there are several points to discuss here and several points to analyze before deducing and concluding, even in a somewhat definitive way, whether it really represents a real danger to the Russian Federation or not. Because the fact that it has an electrical panel that could be improved really shouldn't tell us anything at all. So, let's analyze this issue argument by argument. First of all, why is this a weapon that in some way should become a game changer? On one hand, we're talking about an extremely low price, along with absolutely unbeatable features. We're talking about a missile with a range of about 3,000 kilometers, which would indeed be a game changer for Ukraine, which currently, at most, has missiles that reach about 300 kilometers. So, we're talking about 10 times more range, and the supposed capability, well, the capability announced by Ukraine for this missile. It can carry a warhead, be careful, of 1,000 to 1,150 kilograms of explosive material, which is infinitely superior to some of the best and most commonly used missiles by the Russian Federation in this conflict. Which is an extremely important number, and even quite a bit higher than the explosive part of many of the most commonly used missiles, in fact, on the Russian Federation's side. Now, what are the reasons that should actually make us smile and get sarcastic about this missile? And here, mainly, we're talking about the images we just saw, which show that, as they would say in Russia, it's made of crap and sticks. But secondly, we necessarily have to mention a kind of investigations that, in fact, are now being released by Western media themselves. And they talk about countless corruption schemes that are now coming to light in Ukraine, precisely as a result of the production of this new weaponry. It's not really clear whether the main objective is actually the production itself or rather money laundering, which could be closely related to it. In this regard, we should especially mention the investigation carried out by Kyiv Independent, which states that both this Flamingo missile and the FP-1 drones are closely linked to a single company, which is Firepoint. In 2024, Firepoint received about a third of all drone contracts from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. To be even more precise, it is said that just for the production of the FP-1 drones the company in question received in 2024, about $320 million. And it went from having 18 people on staff to no less than 2,200. Indeed, it's an astonishingly fast growth. And it's still yet to be seen how much money the same company, Firepoint, will have received. But this time for the production of Flamingo missiles, which, although they are very cheap, we're talking about around $50,000 per missile. So, indeed, it's a real flood of money. It makes you at least question the real destructive power of the missiles in question. In this regard, we should mention Ukrainian sources again, especially this blogger, Anatoly Sherry, who has talked about the mass production of these missiles. Flamingo! In fact, it is either already being prepared to be launched soon, or it might have even started some time ago. And it's intended to be located in Denmark, because within Ukrainian territory, Russia would undoubtedly end up discovering it, and, therefore, would very likely eliminate it. However, according to this source, according to the blogger, Denmark agreed to manufacture these missiles precisely because of the change they could bring to the Ukrainian conflict. At long range, the explosive capability they have when combined and, above all, multiplied by mass production, could indeed, according to this source and several others, mark a turning point in this conflict. Let's take a look then, and of course compare the characteristics of this Ukrainian Flamingo missile with other missiles. And here we'll take two of the most widely used by the Russian Federation. On one hand, we have this Flamingo missile, a prototype of another missile produced in the United Kingdom, which is the FP-5 Millennium, which has a range of about 3,000 kilometers, a warhead of up to 1,150 kilos of explosive material, and it is capable of flying at an extremely low altitude, which makes it difficult to detect. We're talking about 100 meters of altitude, which is actually very high. I mean, it's a feature that makes a difference. However, the best part of all this is yet to come, and that's the price, which is around $50,000. Now, be careful with the comparison we make with the missiles from the Russian Federation. Here we go. The Kaliber missiles, which Russia uses in significant quantities during the special military operation, have a range that depends on their versatility because we're talking about a family of missiles, a group of them with different variations, but with an altitude range from 2,000 to 2,600 kilometers. To this, you have to add a warhead of approximately 500 kilograms of explosive material and a flight altitude that could vary from 20 meters. In the case of the maritime versions, up to about 50 to 150 meters, depending on what the situation requires in other versions for this missile. The price, however, is very low compared to what's on the market, but nothing to do with the Ukrainian version, which is about $300,000 to $500,000. It's true that we're talking about a much more complex version. So, meanwhile, the Ukrainian missile, according to some sources, doesn't even have global positioning system and works with maps, which, on one hand, makes it harder to maneuver, but on the other hand, also makes it harder to intercept. For example, by electronic warfare means. But either way, it's a much more basic mechanism. Careful, not necessarily worse, just maybe better adapted to other situations. Whereas, for example, Caliber missiles can not only turn in the air, but even avoid certain obstacles. In this same sense, the J-101 missiles have been developed, also widely used by the Russian Federation. About 2,800 kilometers of range, from 30 to 70 meters of flight altitude, up to 10,000 meters of flight altitude. Once again, more than 30, depending on the version variation and what is needed from this missile. A warhead of about 400 kilos of explosive material, and some features, in some cases, quite similar to the Caliber. Yes, they are much more complex missiles, but also, without a doubt, much more expensive. That is, if we go by what several Ukrainian sources have said, and what I imagine the Kiev regime itself is trying to make it look like. We're talking about a weapon that's practically unmatched, which, although it's not that sophisticated, offers capabilities that far outweigh its price. Indeed, it's quite a bargain, and even more so in military terms. Even more so now, when what Ukraine needs most of all is mass production. And this is precisely where we move on to the conclusions. Taking all of the above into account, how realistic can these massive attacks by Ukraine be? Long range? Deep inside the Russian Federation? Even speaking in terms of a blackout directly in the capital of Russia, where else could it hurt the Kremlin the most? We're talking about Ukrainian engineers, scientists, military personnel, and also just regular soldiers developing a kind of Wunderwaffe in just 9 months. Impossible, not necessarily very difficult, without a doubt. Then, when we compare the features of this missile with the existing missiles in Russia that are widely used by the Federation, even more questions arise. I mean, at this flight altitude, adding this payload capacity, which doubles that of the vast majority of missiles from the Russian Federation with similar characteristics. But to this, we also have to add not just the range, which is undoubtedly the greatest among those we've compared, but also the price, which is 10 times lower than that of its counterparts from the Russian Federation. If we multiply this by the corruption factor, which is even reported by Ukrainian media themselves, as we've already seen, Kyiv Independent, talking about how this might not be so much an arms manufacturing operation as a money laundering operation. How much of what was allocated for the manufacturing and design of this new Flamingo missile actually fulfilled its purpose? It's not known for sure, so it can't be determined or deduced either. Very well. If the Ukrainian military engineers performed little short of a miracle, almost like a work of the Lord himself, or on the other hand, is it more of an achievement that only exists in media terms? Be that as it may, the second point, and I say this after consulting my sources here in Donbass, it has to do with the fact that it doesn't matter how bad the missile in question might be, as long as it actually has something like the range that's being discussed. With those 3,000 kilometers guaranteed, even if it were 1,500, it would actually be enough. But here, the factor that could completely change the game would undoubtedly be mass production. Because if Ukraine is able to launch 200 missiles of this type against Moscow, no matter how well protected the capital is in terms of air defense, it would inevitably end up facing very serious problems. And we're not even talking about cities with much less protection, and in fact, much closer to the front line, such as, for example, Voronezh. That is, one of the key points that, I repeat, Russian military personnel themselves tell me is whether or not Ukraine is able to develop the capacity to mass produce these missiles. And related to this, the third point necessarily arises. A pretty simple question. Well, two in particular. The first one we've already seen in point number 2. Does Ukraine really have the capacity to carry out such a feat in military terms, even with the help of the West? Because it's not clear at all. But the more important question is whether Ukraine has the guts. But above all, once again, whether the West is willing to carry out such a feat in military terms. Because it's not the same for the Kiev regime to have weapons with a range of about 300 kilometers as it is to be able to attack 3,000 kilometers away. And the West knows this very well, because the Kiev regime is something like an arsonist. An extremely dangerous entity, even for itself, because sometimes it can't be controlled, because there's already too much chaos and too much confusion, too much of Zelensky's desire to keep clinging to the presidential seat. In this sense, imagine that they have a weapon capable of attacking even nuclear targets within the Russian Federation. What do you think would stop Ukraine from actually attacking these kinds of targets? Or, I'll go further, would anything stop them? Is there anything that can stop Ukraine from attacking these kinds of targets? Can the West do it? Because, they could always just act surprised, in the Kiev regime. They simply don't know what happened. But if that's the case, the conflict would have escalated almost completely. The conflict would have erupted in just a matter of moments. So we'll have to see to what extent it's possible or not, if there's the ability or not. But above all, at least for me, the key question here is, do they have the guts or not? I'm Liu Sivaya, a war correspondent in Donbass, as well as a geopolitical analyst. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss any of the latest news, because analyses like this are just getting started. And therefore, the most interesting part, without a doubt, is still yet to come. Thank you very much for being here, and see you in the next report.